Boa tarde, pessoal. Tudo bem? Como reter clientes através da experiência online? É sobre isso que nós vamos falar hoje no webinar. Bom, meu nome é Nilo e eu faço parte do time de marketing da Asion. E eu tenho aqui junto comigo dois convidados super especiais. O primeiro deles é o Nick Sandoval, que faz parte do time da Asion de Los Angeles e é mestre em engenharia da computação. O Nick tem mais de uma década de experiência em empresas que otimizam lucros usando a tecnologia. E uma das suas grandes conquistas foi o prêmio de apreciação da NASA por seu trabalho na estação espacial. Hey Nick, how's it going?
Hi Nilo, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the great introduction.
Hi, thank you, Nick. Nosso segundo convidado é o Douglas Cirone, arquiteto de software do Grupo de MED, que tem mais de 50 anos de história e atua em 3 áreas de negócios: varejo, distribuição e indústria, sendo formado pela rede de farmácias Panvel, a distribuidora de medicamentos de MED e o laboratório farmacêutico Bifar. O Douglas tem mais de 9 anos de experiência e trabalha no Grupo de MED desde 2013, participando de toda a migração e evolução tecnológica, sendo responsável pela performance e também disponibilidade de toda a arquitetura digital. Tudo bem, Douglas? Seja muito bem-vindo. Boa tarde.
Boa tarde, tudo bem, galera? É um prazer estar aqui. Obrigado pela introdução.
Que isso, bem-vindo. Obrigado aí pelo seu tempo, pela sua disponibilidade. É um prazer enorme ter você aqui com a gente. Pessoal, antes da gente começar, eu quero dar alguns recados para vocês que estão aí nos assistindo, tá? São recados rápidos. O primeiro deles, eu quero pedir para todo mundo, todos vocês aí que estão nos acompanhando agora, nos sigam nas nossas redes sociais. Nos sigam lá no LinkedIn, no Twitter, no Facebook e no Instagram. E também visitem o nosso blog, que está cheio de conteúdos incríveis sobre tecnologia. E eu vou aproveitar e vou dar um spoiler para vocês, hein? Em breve, vocês também poderão acessar todos os nossos conteúdos através do YouTube e do nosso podcast. Spoiler rápido para quem está assistindo a gente. O segundo recado é que o webinar ele vai ser conduzido em inglês pelo Nick, tá? Mas vocês vão poder acompanhar também toda a tradução aí através das nossas legendas do YouTube. Então, não se preocupem que o conteúdo vai ser acessível para todo mundo. Aqui no canto de baixo, vocês têm os questions and answers, então vocês podem mandar perguntas para a gente durante toda a apresentação, tá? E a gente vai responder tudo no final do webinar. E o melhor eu deixei para o final, claro. Todos que estão assistindo o webinar vão ganhar um crédito de $300 para utilizar a plataforma da Asion. Então, fiquem ligados até o final do webinar, porque o Nick vai falar um pouquinho mais de como é que vocês podem utilizar isso. Beleza, gente? Vamos começar? Nick, I am looking forward to hearing from you, man. Let's get it started right now.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, as I said earlier. Well, so let's get to the topic on hand. How to delight customers through experience. So in getting to that topic, this is going to be our agenda today. I'm going to give a very quick introduction to who Asion is as a company. Then we're going to get into the meat of it, how to delight customers to experience. And we're going to get into how you do this with technology. That's caching at the edge, load balancing at the edge. And this is probably the part that everyone's excited. The next part, Douglas is going to tell us about scenarios and success cases at Penval and his success there. So I'm really excited to hear from you, Douglas. And then we're going to close it off by going to talking about how you take it to the next level. So with that said, so what's a major takeaway you're going to leave with today? You're going to learn how to build a fault-tolerant network that avoids vendor lock-in, how that allows you to scale your traffic across multi-cloud and hybrid cloud that's designed to optimize for the user experience. So with that said, let's go to a quick introduction to who Asion is as a company. So one thing that makes Asion very unique is that we have a strong foothold in Brazil. And actually, most of our employees are in Brazil. Not only that, you can see we have a lot of the big names in Brazil. Now, if you look at just the e-commerce customers, you can see that a lot of the key e-commerce customers use our platform today. Now, I don't want anyone to fear that, okay, I'm not big, so I'm not going to use Asion. We'll go over how this applies to everyone, big and small. So a lot of this is applicable to any e-commerce type of customer. So with that said, why did these customers choose Azion? And I'll go over some of the technologies very quickly that we offer, but we're not going to focus on a lot of these today. So one of the key technologies we have is building serverless applications, being able to do computing at the edge. Another key technology we have is orchestrating endpoints and applications globally. That's essentially automation and automating tasks to make it very easy for you to scale your business. And security is incredibly important, right? So that's why we have a zero trust security model. We have technologies like web access firewalls and whatnot that keeps you secure. And one key thing that we're rolling out is the ability to have Azion key services and platform right on premises. So right there at your facility. But where I'm going to be really focusing on delivering content from the edge. So when we talk about delivering content from the edge, there's really two different sides to it. One, how do you bring web traffic closer to your customer? Two, how do you distribute the web traffic across multi-cloud and on-prem? So with bringing the traffic web closer to your customer, that really leads us to the main point of this webinar, guiding customers through experience. So I'm going to start with some key quotes here. So the first quote we're going to start with is from Gartner. So by 2021, 75% of enterprises data will be processed outside of data centers and centralized cloud. So basically what they're saying is that the vast majority of traffic today, 2021, right, is now no longer housed in a traditional model that we saw in the past where you would have all your data in a single data center, right? Now this data is democratized and it's spread out. So a key question you might ask is why, right? Why is this happening? And that's what we're going to get at to see the key benefits. And that actually leads us to the next quote on that why. And this is actually a great quote from iBusiness Edge. So IT Business Edge. So IT Business Edge quoted both Amazon and Google. And Amazon, they quoted this. Amazon found that every 100 milliseconds of downtime, you lose 1% in sales volume. So let's put that into perspective. For every 100 milliseconds, that's 0.1 seconds. So for every 0.1 seconds, 100 milliseconds of delay, you lose 1% of your sales. So if you had a $2 million of business, you just lost $20,000. 10 million, $100,000. That's a lot of money, right? Just for that 1%. And you would think that it would be linear, right? So 100 milliseconds would be 1%, 200 milliseconds, 2%, and so on. But Google sort of says something else. So Google found for every 0.5 seconds, that's 500 milliseconds for those keeping track. For every half a second, in search page generated time dropped by 20%. So for every half a second, 500 milliseconds again, they saw a 20% drop on their web traffic. That's a huge number, right? So basically, this points to customers becoming increasingly more finicky. They're having higher expectations. The expectation keeps on going up, right? They're expecting more from vendors and e-commerce sites. So one thing that is great is this other quote from Christine Rogers. And what I like about this quote is it really is relevant to what's happening today, right? So we're in COVID, unfortunately, at least when this webinar is being recorded. And it's happening. So in COVID, we saw a major impact in our e-commerce. Now that's been on the positive side for e-commerce, right? We saw a big increase in e-commerce sales. Customers going from brick and mortar, going to e-commerce. So a key question we're asking ourselves is, how long is this going to stay, right? Is this business going to, new business going to be here indefinitely, or are we going to lose some of it? So basically what Christine Rogers, there's at EW, they studied this and they came up with this, that globally 37% of customers believe that the way they're going to shop is going to happen long term. So that's pretty good, because the downside is not our entire sales volume we're gaining is going to be long term, but a good chunk of it, right? 37%, getting close to half almost, right? Is going to be long term. And they go on further to say 39% will shop more online than they did traditionally in stores. So you're going to have 39% saying, you know what, this is the way I'm going to be shopping more of versus my brick and mortar. So why this is all relevant? I love this next quote. So Accenture takes another spin at this on why customer experience is important. And I'm going to read this word for word. In a world of uncertainty, today's leading brands are creating promises not just to shareholders, but to customers employees, and society. Promises of consequences that drive purposeful change for everyone. Experience are where these promises are being felt. So let me digest that for you guys. So basically, it's saying that the customer experience is what customers are expecting more and more from organizations, and it's how they see the actual organization, right? So if they have a bad customer experience, it actually puts a negative image not only on that one shopping experience, but on the organization itself. And this has negative connotation, right? If customers start seeing a bad design website, bad performing website that doesn't drive good customer experience, uh, it's going to trickle down. Uh, and one thing that makes that earlier quote from IT Business Edge, how they quoted Amazon and Google, which I'll use those quotes throughout our presentation about Google 100 milliseconds, very telling, is that it's not just a one-time deal, right? So, okay, maybe you lost that 1% of your customers on that one shopping experience. What Accenture is saying is, if it was enough of this, if it was a bad enough experience for a customer, you may lose that customer indefinitely, right? And that's huge. So, with that said, what are the top challenges we're seeing in the industry today? So there's three key ones, right? And we sort of touched on the first one, that there's a big increase on sales. That's been hard for many to keep up with that level of demand, right? From logistics, from making sure our websites are performant and are keeping up with all this demand. And this is both for the B2B, business to business, and business to consumer space. So this is across the board. Now, another major challenge is that increased finickiness or expectation from customers, right? Our customers are expecting more and more from us. And this next line here, it says a lot, right? It takes a visitor 50 milliseconds. So not even the 100 milliseconds that we talked about, the Amazon saying 1% loss, 50 milliseconds to form an opinion of your website. So think of that when you first meet a person, right? It takes you a very fast couple seconds to actually make an opinion of that person. And it's even quicker than that on creating an opinion on the website. So what's important here is you want to make sure the website is well designed, it's performant, it's attractive, easy to navigate right off the bat. And customers are going to form an opinion very quickly on your website. And a key challenge there also is that customers are geographic apart, right? So, and this is a big issue for e-commerce sites more than brick and mortar, right? So if you're brick and mortar, your customers are going to be local to you, right? The ones that could drive closer to you. The farther they are, the less they're going to be your customer, right? So you have less customers that are farther away. With the advent of e-commerce and the shift to having customers shop more online e-commerce, borders become less relevant. Distances become less relevant to an extent. We can't escape law of physics, which we'll get at later, but customers could come from really anywhere, anywhere within Brazil, anywhere even internationally in many cases. So with that, it's important to use technology to your benefit. And one key thing we're going to be talking about how to use caching and load balancing to enhance the customer experience. So when we talk about customer experience, I want you to think of one thing I think very important. The best website experience is knowing it's not there. So what do I mean by that? Think of this. Put yourself in the eyes of your customer. There's an iPad. You're trying to shop for the latest iPad that just came out, right? Or it could be anything. It could be a new fragrance that was showcased by some movie star, and everybody's shopping for that movie star's fragrance or whatever. There's an increased demand, right? So everybody's going to your website. What happens when they have issues finding that fragrance, that iPad? It's slow to perform. You break that buying cycle, right? So they're in this demand mindset. They're looking at, okay, I'm trying to find my iPad. Okay, what's the accessories I want to have for my iPad? You want to get them in that shopping cycle as quick as possible. You don't want them to think about your website. Your website has to completely disappear to them. Because once they think of your website, it's because something happened, right? And again, it could be it was too hard to navigate. It was not performant enough. There was a delay. When there's a delay, then you say, oh, wait, I'm here now, right? Rather than being right there in your shopping mindset. So you want to make sure that website completely disappears for your customers. So how do we do this with technology? Let's get into one of the key technologies to do this. That's caching at the edge. So with caching at the edge, it's going to help delight customers by bringing the content closer to them. So with that said, let's present a challenge, right? So say in day one, you started your business. You probably started with a single origin. That's fine. That's how most start, right? And it's fine if you have a customer that's really close by to a single origin. But there's going to be some challenges here as you scale, right? As you have customers geographic apart. Now, in this representation, I'm using the globe, right? And this is applicable even if your customers are just across Brazil, right? Because especially how Brazilian networks are created, there's not good pairing between different individual networks. So when this happens, your customers still have to get back to your origin server, right? And we can't escape law of physics. The farther you are, the longer it's going to take to get there. Think of the scenario, or think of another analogy. Say you want to go to a market. The market's across the street from where you live. It's going to be pretty quick for you to get there, right? Now, say this market is several kilometers away from where you live. It's going to take you a lot more time to get to that market that's several kilometers from where you live, right? So that makes sense. Now, you may say, wait a minute, but data is a lot faster. And you're right, data is a lot faster. But the scale is also a lot bigger, right? Uh, Now you're not just traveling from a few kilometers, you're traveling hundreds of kilometers easily, right? You could be traveling from city to city. And as I stated earlier, these network pairing in Brazil is not optimal. So there's times where that short distance might be a lot longer because you may have to go into an area like Florida many times to reroute back to another Brazilian network. And that happens uh, quite prevalently. So with that said, you get this scattered experience. And this is an example of a network. Now, this network, in full disclosure, is not our network. I'm actually using an example to show this. This is a specific network. And in this particular case, the server we're looking at is in Sao Paulo. So say we have our server in Sao Paulo, and I'm going to apologize for butchering the pronunciation here, but say we're in João Pessoa, which is around in Brazil, and we're trying to ping that server in Sao Paulo. That's 70 milliseconds. The good news there, it's better than the 100 milliseconds we talked about from Amazon, so we're not losing that 1% of our sales, which is great. It's above the 50 milliseconds, right, where customers already form an opinion. So the opinion they might be forming may not be the most positive at this point. But it gets worse when we consider SSL, right? Because most of our websites today are encrypted. And it takes about 4 ping responses in its handshaking to actually create that encrypted link. So in reality, that 7 milliseconds becomes 282 milliseconds. Now you're above the 100 millisecond mark. And this is within the same country in this particular optimized network. In other networks, it could be far worse. Now, let's say we had a customer, for just for sake of use case, in Lisbon, Portugal. So that actually jumps up to 223 milliseconds, which translates to 893 milliseconds for that SSL link. Now, luckily where I'm at in Los Angeles, it's a little bit better. It's 760 milliseconds as opposed to that 900 milliseconds. And it's better than like in France, if you had a customer there's 814, and at least I'm not in Australia, that's 1.2 seconds. That's a very bad user experience, right? So hopefully you don't have customers there. And if you did have customers there or that you don't see shopping, maybe this is why you have a very bad experience. Now, I'll say one thing that's interesting. Toronto, Canada, technically is farther away than I am to Sao Paulo. Yet it has a better response time. So the internet used to be referred to as a super data highway, right? You don't use that term too often, but it's very applicable still. The paths you're taking is not necessarily straight lines. It's really a data highway. So like we talked about, you can't escape the law of physics. The more you have to travel in that data highway, the longer it takes. And because of that, it takes me longer to get to Sao Paulo than it does Toronto, Canada. And this, again, is very applicable to whether you're in Brazil or outside of Brazil. So even if you don't have customers outside of your borders, it's going to be applicable and it's going to really affect the customer experience. Now, there's other things too to even consider beyond just the scattered experience, right? Think of back to my example of like the iPad, right? There's a new iPad, a new iPhone, and something else released that causing consumers to flock to your website, a fragrance, whatever that is. Maybe it's raining, everybody's trying to look for umbrellas at your website. Or you have a big sale, or Black Friday. That's a great example. There's surges that associate with this, right? And the problem with that is handling that surge. When you have a single origin, being able to handle that surge becomes very problematic, and it actually could have a very bad experience for a lot of your customers because your server starts getting loaded. It could even crash under load, and that happens more often than I would care to say, but it happens quite a bit. So this leads to missed revenue opportunities, right? And think of also the case, what if that single origin fails? That's very bad, right? Obviously, that's going to cause a lot of missed revenue opportunities if you have a single origin that fails. So what's the solution to that? Let's democratize that data. And rather than have that data in a single origin server, we spread it out the network. So this is why 75% of organizations, back to what Gartner was talking about, is doing this today, because it creates this massive issue of that scattered user experience and having the ability of losing revenue because you have a central point of failure. We don't want that, right? So we want to create a network that is as close to customers possible. So rather than have the data far away from your customers, let's bring the data as close to your customer as possible by putting it across many different platforms. Now, this is specifically on your static content. So we cache the content close to your customer. That's going to create a uniform customer experience. It's going to give you the ability to handle that search because you're not handling that search not in just one compute area, but across a very large area. You're not going to have a single point of failure because you have a lot of different levels of failure points, right? And this is going to translate to no missed revenues. Now, for those, again, thinking, okay, wait a minute, I'm just in Brazil. I don't know if I really need this. This is gives you an idea of the scale of LATAM and in Brazil, what type of how close we can get the content to your customer. This is going to be able to allow you to scale too, right? As you want to go global, you can be able to do that quite readily. You don't have to worry about where your origin servers are and whatnot to that nature. Even if your goal is just uh, take over all Brazil, or going from Brazil to LATAM, or the rest of the globe for that matter. So with that said, that leads us to our other technology we're going to talk about. So delivering content from the edge also has to do with distributing web traffic through multiple clouds and on-prem. So we're going to try to do the same thing, democratize data, but in a different way in this particular case. So we're going to build a fault-tolerant network that avoids that vendor lock-in, which nobody wants, right? And it allows you to scale to across multi-clouds and hybrid clouds. And I'll define that as we go through this. So that leads us to this topic, load balancing at the edge. So with that said, the goal here is to delight customers through reliable content delivery. So we want to make our customers happy by making sure that they always could access their content, right? That your website is always there for them, that they could get there, right? So let's go through that same scenario I talked about earlier. You started a single origin. Let's put the origin somewhere else, and for just the sake of argument, then another solution you could say, I'm just going to scale this rather than using an edge cache platform. I'm just going to put my origins everywhere. Now, this can be a solution to some extent, but it has some inherent challenges. One thing you could do is, okay, I'm going to have all these origin servers in every country, and then each one has its own web address. But then what happens if there's a failure? What happens if there's too much loading in that particular server, whatnot? So you really need to have an ability to balance that traffic across that. You need to have the ability to handle faults. And this gets really complex when you go global and scale. And it gets complex even if you want to do multiple countries. Like say you want to put 2 servers in Brazil, you want to put 2 servers in the US. That becomes problematic if you don't have a load balancing technology. So with that, let's talk about what load balancer is, and then we'll talk about how it really helps you. So the key things that's going to help you is balancing traffic across multiple origins, handling faults seamlessly, and no missed revenues from the single points of failure. So let's say we had a user that wants to access your server. So it's very easy concept, right? We could grab that user and distribute them to the appropriate server. And there's many mechanisms that we use behind the scenes to do this, from being able to look at the number of connections, seeing where they're located, and choosing the best location based on the user location. There's a lot of intelligence to this. So very simply said, so if you have one user going one server, then you have another user, you could balance the load balancer. That's sort of where the name comes, right? So you're spreading that load to another server. So this is going to give you a lot better experience from a customer's standpoint, because your servers aren't going to be loaded. So say you had a Black Friday incident and everyone's shopping on your website, you could spread that load across multiple areas at one time. So you're not hitting that one server and much less likelihood of a failure, right? But with that said, failures do happen. So what happens if one of your origin servers fail? The technology will automatically detect that and automatically redirect the traffic if you have a failed origin server, which is great, right? So now we have a very reliable, fault tolerant system. But some of you may be looking at this and wait, Nick, what if that that load balancer fails? That's a good question, right? Because if that load balancer fails in a traditional model, there's not much you could do, right? It fails the whole system. But this example I'm giving, or this diagram I'm giving, is not indicative of what ASEAN's network really looks like. I used it for simplicity. We actually use something very different. Our load balancer is actually distributed. It's distributed. So the same as we try to bring the content closer to your customer, we try to bring the decision of the load balancer close to your customer as possible. So these load balancers are now located close to your customers. So they're distributed. There's many of them. There's not a single point of failure. It's going to free you from vendor lock-in. And now I'm going to get to that third point now by what I mean by that. So free you from vendor lock-in. So in this particular case, you can see that I'm showing two cloud providers and on-prem. So this is known as hybrid cloud. So hybrid cloud is when you have your on-prem, your bare metal, mixed with your cloud provider. So why you want to do this? Cost savings is a big factor. Cloud could be expensive. So if you had your on-prem and you have your cloud servers to augment your on-prem, like say Black Friday, you need more processing power, you could use the cloud for that additional processing power. And most of the time have your on-prem be your primary source. If your on-prem fails, it could fail over, to your cloud providers. Now, when I talk about cloud providers, it could really be any cloud provider. Now, in this particular case, it's like, let's just go full hog and go complete cloud, right? So this is called multi-cloud. So multi-cloud is when you have just pure cloud providers, not mixing in hybrid cloud, which means mixing in on-prem. So in this particular case, you can see that I could choose any cloud vendor. And that's, if you ask a lot of organizations why they haven't gone cloud, for those that haven't, it's usually because of that fear of vendor lock-in, right? I don't want to go to AWS or Azure or Google Cloud and be locked in to their pricing policies and be held hostage. So with a technology like load balancer, that's not going to happen to you, because you could redirect the traffic across multiple different cloud providers and not fear that vendor lock-in. So we talked about two different technologies and how they play, and once you use one over the other. And the actual statement here is you don't want to use one over the other. You actually use both. And if you had to choose one, you can use Edge Cache. So I mentioned earlier, so Edge Cache is really designed to accelerate your content. But the type of content it's going to accelerate is your static content. Think of like images and things like that to your website. It's not designed for fault tolerance. That's not its goal. That's what load balancer is really about, is optimizing for that fault tolerance. So you can have two different work cases, right? So you normally going to start with edge caching, and as you have multiple origins, as you want to be able to democratize that load balancing decision and spread it across multiple origins, that's where load balancer becomes a play. So with that said, let's talk about scenarios and success cases. So we talked a little bit about some big numbers early on, right? So remember, it takes 50 milliseconds for a customer to form an opinion. So that's why these numbers are very relevant. So at ASEAN, one thing we did is we brought that content closer to your customer, and because we can't escape the law of physics, we know that. And because we brought it close to your customer, we could get down that processing time to 30 milliseconds. So I don't know if you remember the example I gave about Joe Pessoa earlier, that it was 70 milliseconds in that particular network. In our case, it would be 30 milliseconds because of this ability to have the data close to your customer as possible. So we bring it down to 30 milliseconds. We do that with having over 40 point of presences, or these edge nodes, across the globe and expanding. And we actually built out the system to be 13 times capacity. So why do we do that? Because we want to over provision our system to be highly reliable, to make sure it could handle traffic loads. And that's why we're pretty confident in our system to give 100% uptime guarantee, 100%. Anything less than that, and we actually refund you money. So with that, I'm really excited to present our next speaker. So Douglas, I am excited to hear what you have to say for us today.
Hey, Nick, thanks for everything, for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you,
Bom, vou
Douglas.
falar em português, pessoal. Trabalho no grupo de média, né, que é Panvel, principalmente o nome mais conhecido, desde 2013. Então, tivemos bastante aprendizado ao longo desse caminho, né? E a Asian foi uma parceira incrível para a gente conseguir atingir um objetivo que era ter performance nos nossos websites. E eu vou mostrar 2 casos de uso que a gente utiliza a Asian aqui dentro. O primeiro deles é cache, que é sobre cache e redução de imagem, consumo de banda, que é muito além de apenas cache. Tem algumas informações da última Black Friday que a gente teve, né? Essas são informações já direto do dashboard da Asian, né? Durante a semana da Black Friday, a gente conseguiu economizar 9,5 terabytes de dados, contando imagens e conteúdos estáticos. Isso porque dentro da própria Amazon tem uma ferramenta que reduz, tu consegue reduzir o tamanho da tua imagem para fazer os ícones, ou enfim, qualquer imagem menor. Tu tem um tamanho único lá e tu consegue diminuir isso de acordo com a necessidade. Então, numa aplicação mobile, essa imagem pode ficar menor e consumir até menos banda para o teu cliente final, tendo uma sensação de muito mais rápido a entrega do conteúdo. Outro ponto importante aqui para nós, utilizando a Asian, a gente conseguiu economizar banda, porque a nossa infraestrutura ela é on-premise, então a gente tem links de internet e utilizando os Edge Applications a gente consegue concentrar muito uso de internet externamente. Então o que acaba vindo para cá é somente o que é necessário mesmo para ser processado. O conteúdo estático acaba ficando tudo nas pontas. Um outro ponto é a quantidade de requests que a gente consegue atender. Então, isso acaba a nossa infra não precisa ser tão grande para conseguir atender um número muito alto de clientes. Então, a gente consegue economizar recurso interno e entregar muito mais velocidade na ponta, tendo um teste de performance muito alto. Um outro ponto importante, principalmente para um e-commerce, é a questão de segurança. E isso a gente tem já na Asian o WAF configurado, então todas as nossas requisições obrigatoriamente tem que passar pela Asian, e isso ele já consegue bloquear scaling injection, qualquer tentativa de requisição inválida que não precisa ser expendido, gasto tempo internamente para desenvolvimento, a gente não precisa ter esse custo, a gente consegue utilizar já direto o WAF na Asian. Então isso reduz até mesmo o tempo de desenvolvimento aqui dentro. Essa aqui é a arquitetura nova do site. Então, a gente tem os nossos Nginx, o Apache, enfim, com 2 links. Então, a gente tem 2 origens. E isso está configurado um load balancer na Asian. A gente já, tendo esse load balancer, a gente teve problemas em alguns links e a gente conseguiu simplesmente desligar na Asian um dos links e todo o tráfego passar por um link que não estava com problema. Então, isso nos garantiu que o nosso cliente final não estava sendo impactado. A gente utiliza a Asian no site e a gente tem a CDN já direto com a Asian também. E aí é para otimização de imagem, aquilo que eu comentei no início. Temos mais uma parte importante aqui de falar na migração do site, que é sobre as functions, que a gente utilizou para a gente fazer um teste AB. Ou seja, a gente não precisou virar a chave inteira para ir para um site novo. A gente fez um desenvolvimento de um site novo e conseguimos, utilizando a Asian, fazer um teste AB, colocando percentuais de usuários para ir para essa nova arquitetura. Então, isso nos deu garantia de disponibilidade e evitar que grandes problemas fossem para a produção. Então, a gente conseguiu ter um controle melhor da nossa aplicação. Então, a gente utilizou site novo, essa infra aqui, e a Asian lá direcionava para o site antigo quando alguns clientes, um percentual de clientes acessavam. E aí isso ficava por 2 dias, esse cliente acessando o site novo, e se ele acessasse de novo e expirasse aquele cookie setado, ele iria para o site antigo ou para o novo, dependia do cookie que ele caía. E em 2 semanas a gente conseguiu colocar uma aplicação crítica em produção, utilizando as melhores práticas de mercado, graças à utilização da function lá para poder fazer o teste AB. Bom, esses são os dois casos, esse último aí é o mais recente, que a gente não tinha utilizado as functions ainda. E isso foi uma grande virada de chave até mesmo para os próximos sistemas que a gente for migrar, a gente utilizar essa feature. É isso. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Douglas. I learned a lot. That was incredible. I appreciate it. So you heard Douglas really talk about some other technologies, right? And that's really taken it to the next level from what we're talking about. So these are some technologies, right? Like serverless and edge computing. So what are these technologies and why would they benefit your customer? So think about it this allows you to personalize the content around your individual customers. So for example, you may have a customer that's shopping maybe for that iPad, and you see them do that on a regular basis. And then maybe you want to show them technology in your homepage. So it allows you to customize your homepage. It allows them to customize your website around their unique interests. Not only that, you could do things on trigger on activity, like in the case of an iPad, right? As I'm using as my example, you see that they're looking at iPads. They probably want a stylus. They probably want a case with it. Maybe they're looking at a fragrance. Well, what else goes with that fragrance? That fragrance. I use an analogy of a movie star early on that made that fragrance popular. If that's the case, maybe what was that movie star wearing? Do you have that to showcase as well? Things of that nature, right? So it allows you to really do those recommendations that's going to help you enhance your sale and increase your wallet share. But you can also trigger on external factors. Like, for example, you may know, or your website may know that hey, it's raining outside. That's what the weather report said. So, hey, if it's raining, maybe you want to sell umbrellas. You're in winter, it's cold. Maybe you want to sell hot beverages or powder mixes or whatever you may have that will, or sweaters and jackets for cold weather. But the real power is when you leverage other platforms, like third-party. When you do third party, it allows you to do things like automate inventories, just an example, run security checks and audits. But there's really a whole lot more. I'm just touching the surface on what you could do with edge computing. So stay tuned. We'll talk about this in a future webinar. It's just too big of a topic for us to fit in this one. It really is enhancing the user experience and taking it one step further. Right? And you can learn about a lot of key things when it comes to this unique technology. So with that, and wrapping it up, just a quick summary again of some things that we offer. So we built a very fast network that allows you to have customer experience by making it very performant for your customers, and make sure that the data is always reliable, and bringing that content, democratizing it, bringing it closer to your customer. And we do this by building out a very large network that's overbuilt by a factor of 13 times in this particular case, and that allows us to have the 100% guarantee. So with that, now I don't want you to just take my word for everything I said. I want you to feel free to try this out, kick the tires, as you could say. So we're going to give all our new customers a $300 credit to try our platform, and that's good for a whole year. So we will be sending you emails on how to do this. And if you don't get the email, if for whatever reason you've seen a recording of this and you want to know more about that, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll give you this credit. We'll honor that. So with that said, let's open up to question and answers. Really ask us anything. So Nilo, I'm excited. What are the questions coming in?
All right, Nick. So let me ask you a couple of questions that we have here. So I'm going to ask them either in Portuguese and also in English, okay? So that way everyone can understand them. So, Nick, você mencionou sobre o e-commerce, né? Mas e outros segmentos como fintech? So Nick, you mentioned e-commerce, but what about other industries like fintech, for example?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Yeah, so we focused on this webinar on e-commerce specifically because customer experience is really fundamental when it comes to e-commerce. But they don't own just that, right? Other markets really care about their customers as well. So it's really spread out. Um, you know, e-commerce, we're the leaders in that. Fintech, financial technologies is a big play for us too. But it's really could expand to manufacturing. Whoever really wants to build a good user experience, uh, this technology is applicable to. And now I focused a lot on website and whatnot, but this is really applicable beyond even that. So IoT applications, yes, they wouldn't apply to this because uh, jitter and latency is a big thing in those type of spaces. So this really opens up the door to a whole lot of industries. So just because you're not e-commerce, don't feel like, okay, I have to ignore any of what Nick said. You know, there's definitely here technology that could be applicable to you.
That's awesome, Nick. So I have one more question here. Eu posso usar o load balancer e add caching ao mesmo tempo? So Nick, can I use load balancer and also add caching at the same time?
Absolutely, and that's actually the ideal scenario. If you have to use one individually, it'll be just edge caching. You don't want to use load balancer by itself. You want to use it jointly, but that's really the best scenario because then you'll be able to have the best user experience, being able to bring that static content to your customers, but also for your dynamic content. What do you do there? That's where load balancer really becomes a big player in.
Okay, great. And como é que funciona o health check em referência ao load balancer, né? Então, Nick, how does the health check in refer to load balancer actually work?
That's a great question. So we want to make sure with load balancer that it's a fault tolerant system, right? So we talked about how load balancer itself is distributed, so you have multiple load balancers. But what about your origin servers? So we have a health check. We're testing those origin servers. And if we see that origin is down for whatever reason, then we'll redirect customers to another origin. So that's how the health check technology works is we make sure that those origins are actually up. And if they're not, we'll redirect them somewhere else. So it makes sure that your customers still can access your data.
And the last question is actually one of my favorite ones because I really want to know how that works actually. So how does the cache decide what to cache? And just in Portuguese, just repeat that in Português, como é decidido o que armazenar, né? Como é que a gente entende ali o que deve ser armazenado? So, Nick, it's all yours.
Thank you. That's a good question. So the cache technology is really optimized to cache static content. So you actually would set up an H timer and tell it, okay, this is the how long this content is going to stay on the server, and that could be up to even a year. It could be from days to a year. It depends how often your website's changing. Most of our customers actually set it for a long time. So again, it's not really designed to optimize that dynamic content. That's why you have the load balancing technologies, and we have other technologies like application acceleration that's designed for that. But for that static content, it's really easy. And one thing you would do too is on your actual website, you would have it pointed to our origin server, the HTML code, and that's how your customers access our cache server. So it's really easy. It's really almost a hit one check mark in our website and enter a few parameters. And then on your website, you would change the HTML code to point to our servers. And that's about it.
All right, Nick. So thank you so much for everything, actually. So thanks for teaching us a lot today. Thank you, Douglas, also for, we got to learn a lot from you guys. So thank you a lot. So I don't know if you have any other thing to tell us, and everybody who's watching us right now, please just go ahead, Nick, and then Douglas can do the same.
Well, I did want to say thank you to everyone. So thank you for everyone that attended this webinar, and for those looking at the recorded copy as well. And I wanted to give my email, nick.sandoval@asean.com. Feel free to ask me anything. Now, if as you can tell, I don't speak Portuguese. So if you have questions in Portuguese, feel free to reach out, contact@asean.com. We have a lot of experts there that that could answer your question straight in Portuguese. I sort of mentioned earlier, I'll say it again. In ASEAN, we have a very large staff in Brazil. So we have solution architects, tech support, and solution sales. So feel free to reach out to us. We'll help you in every way we can, and make sure that you're very successful. And I promise I won't be hurt if for a reason you reach out to somebody else versus me. I'll say that. And Douglas, again, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nilo.
Só para falar em português
everyone.
também, Douglas. Só para falar em português.
Ah,
Também muito obrigado pela
beleza.
sua presença. Acho que o Nick, obrigado, Nick. Obrigado também, Douglas. Obrigado pela sua disponibilidade, por todo o conhecimento que você trouxe aqui, compartilhou com a gente hoje. Então, obrigado. Se quiser dar uma última palavra para o pessoal que está assistindo a gente também, fica à vontade, Douglas.
Era isso mesmo, cara. Eu queria mostrar o quão importante foi a utilização, né, da Asian aqui dentro e como torna fácil a implementação de algumas coisas que já tem pronto, e o desenvolvimento não precisa se preocupar, né? Principalmente na questão de segurança. E, claro, e o suporte de vocês falo como cliente mesmo, são muito bons, tá? Os tickets são atendidos bem rápido.
Legal, é sempre ótimo ouvir feedbacks positivos. E para a gente finalizar aqui, eu queria agradecer a todos vocês que estão nos assistindo. A gente teve uma audiência incrível. Um dos nossos primeiros webinars, né? Em breve a gente vai trazer mais conteúdos para vocês. Então, gente, obrigado. Um grande abraço para todo mundo e a gente se vê. Abraço, até mais, gente. Tchau, tchau.